7.2 Adding, subtracting rational expression. So to add or subtract fractions, we know that we need to have a least common denominator. And then we write it into equivalent expression with the denominator, least common denominator, and then we add the numerators together. So the first step we want to do is review how to find the least common denominator. So to find out the least common denominator, first you're gonna factor the denominators completely and then collect the greatest exponent of each factor as a part of the least common denominator. So by saying that, for example, 1a, first I'm gonna factor out the denominator. So for the first fraction, it is x minus 4 and then x plus 3. For the second fraction, that will be x minus 4 and then x plus 4. And then for the LCD part, for least common denominator, we look at each factor and then we're going to have to collect the greatest exponents of each factor. So first up, x minus 4 is in the first fraction and also in the second fraction. And when we compare the exponent of those x minus 4, both of them is 1. So that will consider is the greatest, so I will use x minus 4 as part of my least common denominator. Then moving on to the next factor. So I have x plus 3 in the first fraction, but not in the second fraction. So x plus 3 to the 1 power will be considered the greatest exponent for this particular factor. So x plus 3 will become part of the least common denominator. Finally, the last factor that we have in check is x plus 4. And x plus 4 is only in the second fraction, not in the first fraction. So similar to x plus 3, we will consider that as part of the least common denominator. Now we got the LCD for example A. So once again, we are collecting the greatest exponent of each factor. Okay. Let's try the second example. See you can follow better or not. So first up, we're gonna try to factor completely. So 3x and then 5, and it will be the first fraction. Both of them is a negative factor, which is x. This one is not factorable because, as you can see, negative 3x plus 10, both of them is negative factor. I will never get the factor for 10 that give multiply two number give you 10 and then add it up to give you 3. You will never get that one. Okay, so therefore this example B, the first fraction, the denominator is not factorable, and the second fraction is factorable, which is it will give me what, x plus 2 and then x plus 1. So therefore, when it's not factorable, we will just write it down as in what? A trinomial, something that is not factorable. X squared minus 3x plus 10. So now, collecting LCD, and this time the LCD will be much easier because you can see that this is the only trinomial in both of the fractions that's not factorable. So that will be part of it. So x squared minus 3x plus 10. And then the other two factors on the second fractions is only what, one exponent 1 each. So therefore, those will be also part of our LCD. So technically, this one is basically LCD is made up with the original two trinomials. Okay. Next, So it doesn't matter how many fractions do you have, but finding out the LCD is the same way. So for this one, let's try to factor the first fraction, which will be x minus 1 and then x minus 1. And probably you might want to write this down as in terms of exponents, right? So that way it will make it easier for you to compare the exponents. So I will write it down as x minus 1 squared. And for the next one, what you want to do is you want to rewrite it into descending power first and then factor it out. Meaning what? This should be x squared minus 4x plus 3. So after you look at that in a descending power on a side work, then you can easily factor it out, which is x minus 1 and then x minus 3. That's what you will get. Okay? And then similarly, the next one, if you do on a side work, that will be you rearranged it, okay? Rearrange it, which is going to be negative 4x plus 4, and factor out the greatest common factor, negative 4 out. That will give me x minus 1. So you can do those on a side work, okay? So that you will not mess up your float. So now what we want is we want to find out the least common denominator for these three fractions. So my LCD, so first we're going to look at the x minus 1. So in the first fraction, x minus 1, I have it. Second fraction, I have x minus 1. Third fraction, I also have x minus 1. According to the rule, what we are collecting is what? The greatest exponent of the factor. So in this case, I have x minus 1 squared, x minus 1 to the first power, x minus 1 to the first power. So therefore, when we collect it, it must be x minus 1 to the second power, because we have to collect the one that have the greatest exponent. That's the reason why I asked you to rewrite it in terms of exponent earlier. And then we continue looking at each factor, other one. So the next one will be what? X minus 3. And this is in only in the second fraction. So this will be part of my LCD. And then finally, the last number is what? Minus negative 4. So this is the only factor. Also, this will be part of my LCD. So now we get our least common denominator. Continuing on the next example, again, go ahead, pause it, and then go ahead and factor completely, and then try to find out what is your LCD. See you will get the same as me or not. Okay, so factoring out the least common denominator completely. So the first factor will be 3 and x. So that will be positive 5 and then minus 2. And this will be negative x minus 2 and then x plus 2. And this will be x plus 5 squared. So finally, my least common denominator, going back to each factor. Now, here's some little trick that I'm going to show to you. See this negative? You can basically put it in the numerator, and then so you don't have to talk about a negative LCD anymore. Similarly, right here, you can do that also. Okay, because sometimes if you put it in negative sign in the LCD, it's much difficult to continue. You can make more mistakes, right? So continuing one by one, like before. So when I look at it, 3 is the only factor that I have, so 3 will be part of my LCD. And then the next one, when I look at it, it will be what? The 5, x plus 5. And I have x plus 5 squared. So according to the rule, I'm going to be taking the highest exponent. So it will be x plus 5 squared. Right? And then continuing this will be x minus 2 and x minus 2. Both of them is same degree, so x minus 2 is my part of my LCD, and then finally will be x plus 2. So this LCD has a lot of factors in it, and that will be my final answer for least common denominator.